History as it happens, March 26, 2024. Securing Ukraine, negotiating with Putin?
President Zelensky has blamed the fall of Avdiivka, a key town in the east of the country, on a lack of long-range weapons.
The vote we will soon take to provide military weapons for Ukraine is the most important vote we will ever take as United States senators.
And tonight, President Putin has congratulated them for taking complete control of the town.
Congress's inability to pass a Ukraine supplemental is sending a dangerous message to the world.
Could the profits from frozen Russian financial assets be used to pay for weapons for Ukraine?
What has happened to America that we shrink from our traditional role of standing up against tyrants and dictators?
In a war of attrition, which side will prevail? The larger, more economically and militarily powerful country, or the smaller country that relies almost entirely for money and arms on other powers? If you believe the war is turning against Ukraine, are negotiations with Putin a realistic alternative? That's next with Anatol Lieven as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
If we continue giving aid, I do think that there is not a certainty, but a strong possibility that we can help the Ukrainians hold, most of their existing lines. But once again, the biggest disaster for Ukraine since the beginning of the war was last year's offensive, when they lost massively. Because it's clear, and we've also talked about this before, that at present, recent developments in military technology do overwhelmingly favour the defensive. Ukraine hopefully can stand on the defensive successfully, but so can Russia.
In early April 2008, President George Bush delivered remarks at the NATO summit in Bucharest that haunt Eastern Europe to this day.
This week, our alliance must also decide how to respond to the request by Georgia and Ukraine to participate in NATO's membership action plan. These two nations inspired the world with their rose and orange revolutions, and now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the membership action plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe. It would send a signal throughout the region that these two nations are and will remain sovereign and independent states. Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO and offers them a clear path forward to meet that goal.
Well, Germany and France opposed inviting Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, and Russia's president at the time warned that Moscow would view any attempt to expand NATO to Russia's borders as a direct threat. Now, a lot has changed since then, except for two things. Ukraine and Georgia are still not in NATO, and Russia's president is still Vladimir Putin. Shortly after the Bucharest summit, Russia went to war in Georgia, and as we all know, the United States and Europe did not go to war to defend Georgia.
We will continue to stand behind Georgia's democracy. We'll continue to insist that Georgia's sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity be respected.
Well, as our guest in this episode argues, events have also proven the U.S. and Europe will not fight directly for Ukraine's sovereignty or independence either. This leaves Ukraine reliant solely on its own manpower to defend itself. In a paper titled The Diplomatic Path to a Secure Ukraine, Anatol Lieven and George Beebe write, "Conventional wisdom holds that a negotiated settlement to the Ukraine war is neither possible nor desirable. This belief is false," they say. It's also extremely dangerous for Ukraine's future. The war is not trending toward a stable stalemate, but toward Ukraine's eventual collapse. Russia has corrected many of the problems that plagued its forces during the first year of fighting and adopted an attrition strategy that is gradually exhausting Ukraine's forces, draining American military stocks, and sapping the West's political resolve. They go on to say Ukraine's best hope lies in a negotiated settlement that protects its security, minimizes the risks of renewed attacks or escalation, and promotes broader stability in Europe and the world. Skeptics, they say, counter that Russia has no incentive to make meaningful concessions in a war it is increasingly winning. But this belief underestimates the gap between what Russia can accomplish through its own military efforts and what it needs to ensure its broader security and economic prosperity over the longer term. I'll put a link to this paper in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up for it at historyasithappens.com or at Substack. Just search for History As It Happens. Now, some of my recent guests, Michael Kimmage, Mark Galeotti, Maria Snegovaya, and Liana Fix, just to name four, argue that as long as Putin is in power, a negotiated end to the war is probably impossible. Yet we know most wars do end in negotiations. Total victory, unconditional surrender, is rare. But whether Russia is open to negotiating now or a year from now, whenever, depends on the military realities on the ground, and right now neither side seems capable of a breakthrough, and an accurate understanding of Russia's actual war aims. So if you believe Russia won't stop with Ukraine and will target Moldova or the Baltics next, then you probably think trying to negotiate is a fool's errand. Can Putin even be trusted? This isn't the summer of 2001, George Bush standing next to Putin at their first news conference.
I said in Poland, I'll say it again, Russia is not the enemy of the United States. As a matter of fact, after our meeting today, I'm convinced it can be a strong partner and friend, more so than people could imagine.
But let's examine these ideas and assumptions now with Anatol Lieven, who heads the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft here in Washington. He is an expert on Russia and Eastern Europe. Hello again, Anatol Lieven.
Good to be back.
So you say in your paper about diplomacy in Ukraine, by combining defensive aid to Ukraine with a vigorous diplomatic offensive, the United States could secure independence for the vast bulk of Ukraine, provide a viable path toward its prosperity, and mitigate the dangers of long-term confrontation with Russia and Europe. But I want to focus on the first part of that statement, vast bulk of Ukraine. So are you saying here that in the end, Ukraine is going to have to cede some territory?
It has ceded territory. That is the reality. And all the talk now, which in military terms is extremely sensible, is to help Ukraine stand successfully on the defensive. And, I think that if this aid package goes through in time and aid continues, then there is a good chance that we can help Ukraine to do that. But Ukraine standing on the defensive implies that what Russia now holds will remain in Russian hands. Now, I am certainly not suggesting that Ukraine should formally and legally give up any territory. The Ukrainians cannot do that. We cannot urge them to do so. It's politically impossible. It's legally wrong. But if you look at other examples, Turkey has occupied northern Cyprus for the past 50 years. We've never actually recognized that. We've never recognized the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but we can't do anything about it without going to war with Turkey. The United States, amazingly enough, has never actually recognized Indian sovereignty over Kashmir, but nobody is going to try to push the Indians out. So my point is that this is not actually giving up anything that Ukraine has not lost already. And in a war, in any war, what do you begin with? You begin with military reality, with sober military analysis. And sober military analysis suggests not just that Ukraine almost certainly now cannot reconquer its lost territories, but that if it tries to do so and loses heavily again, as it did last year, this could be the shortest route to a much worse Ukrainian defeat, which, by the way, could happen this year anyway, if you read the accounts of the state of the Ukrainian armed forces and talk to military experts in private. But we shouldn't, adopt a strategy that would make such an outcome even more likely.
Part of the problem with discourse around this issue is people will say, oh, you're rewarding aggression. And, oh, maybe that's true. You're certainly not in favor of that. And as you say, no one has to legally recognize Russia's conquest here. And I don't think any country would. Maybe I shouldn't say
Or
any
should
country. There might be some country somewhere that recognizes this for some reason.
Belarus, maybe.
Yeah, the rest of the world won't do it. But I've mentioned Alexander Motil to you in the past. I actually had the professor on my show. He wrote a column some years ago prior to the outbreak of the full war. It's time for Ukraine to let the Donbass go. He doesn't believe that anymore, though, and the counter-argument to your position here, the reason why folks say Ukraine can't do this is simply because the argument goes, as long as Putin is in power, it's simply not possible to reach some kind of accommodation, that you simply would be rewarding aggression and making it easier for Russia to launch its next war.
Yes, I know, but this is flawed on so many counts. I mean, first, clearly now, unless he drops dead or is assassinated, Putin is going to remain in power, at least for the next 6 years. The overwhelming likelihood is that he will then hand over power to a successor of his choice, who will, in essence, follow the same policies. Maybe will be more liberal at home, but no Russian leader from the existing regime is going to surrender in Ukraine and meet Ukrainian conditions for peace. So what you're basically saying at that point is that the war must go on forever, for the indefinite future. The Russian government is what it is. You negotiate with it or you don't negotiate at all. Secondly, the assumption that Russia will use a settlement in Ukraine as a springboard for future aggression is something that exists purely in the minds of the West. Putin has never said this. In fact, he's categorically denied it. It would seem inherently implausible that having lost the entire army with which it invaded Ukraine in 2022, that whole army has been destroyed in terms of manpower and in terms of equipment, and more than destroyed because many of the reserves have also been killed, and had to fight for months and months to capture small towns in eastern Ukraine, that Russia would then go on to launch a new direct war with NATO, including, the risk not just of catastrophic conventional defeat, but of escalation to nuclear annihilation. For what? Ukraine, for reasons that should be apparent to any expert on the region, is considered by the Russian establishment to be vital in a whole set of ways that simply does not apply to Poland or the Baltic states. But the third thing is, look, as long as Russia is there, Russia will be a potential threat to Ukraine. The only way to eliminate that threat is to destroy Russia. The problem is that would also incinerate the world. I was at a somewhat bizarre conversation last night at which a European supporter of Ukraine said, but it's absurd to say that just because a country is on another country's border, that it's always going to be a threat. After all, Canada is not a threat to the United States. And I had to reply, I didn't think that Russia was going to very closely resemble Canada anytime very soon. That does also, of course, which I didn't say, slightly miss the point that America is 8 times larger than Canada, whereas Russia is 5 times larger than Ukraine.
To say nothing of the different histories and everything else involved there. Yeah, but I get your point. No, this is the point that President Obama made at the end of his second term in that interview with The Atlantic, where he said Ukraine is always going to mean more to Russia than it will the United States. Ukraine is not part of NATO. It's not in the EU. It's not a treaty ally. It's a core Russian interest, not a U.S. one. But there are good reasons why Ukraine never made it into NATO, etc.
Well, and the key reason is, as we have both demonstrated and said again and again and again, is that we will not go to war to defend Ukraine. When Macron last week suggested that NATO troops might be sent to Ukraine, every NATO government, even the Poles and the British, immediately said no. Well, if we're not going to fight to defend Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine's NATO membership is obviously empty. It's a lie. This is what Article 5 means. Yes. We should have thought of that before, the Bush administration ever proposed NATO membership for Ukraine.
Yes, the 2008 Bucharest conference, where George W. Bush made those remarks.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
You know, the crazy thing is that immediately after that, there was a war between Georgia and Russia, which Georgia lost, of course, crushingly, over South Ossetia. It's true. I mean, the Bush administration had not promised to help Georgia, but, you know, the Georgian president had come to Washington and been praised to the skies, and he'd been given every emotional suggestion that America was, in fact, an ally of Georgia. What did we do? Nothing. And when Vice President Cheney proposed in cabinet that America might at least send troops to Georgia, not into action, but to sort of deter the Russians, the whole of the rest of the Bush cabinet said no. And Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, vetoed it on the spot. And that, by the way, was on the basis of a meeting of the Joint Chiefs, every one of whom had also said this is out of the question. At that point, why on earth did we go on suggesting that NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia is a possibility?
This is a geographical issue in part. I don't want to return to the issue of NATO expansion again here, but just look where Georgia is on a map. It's not next to France. Why, in your view, is Russia winning, or why is its attrition strategy succeeding?
Russia by now, you know, after capturing, since 2014, heavily populated areas of southern eastern Ukraine, and after so many Ukrainians have fled to the west, the Russian population is about 5 times that of Ukraine. Before the war, Russia's GDP was 14 times that of Ukraine. It's much higher now. It would be overwhelmingly higher if we were not, of course, basically by now, or the Europeans are supporting the entire Ukrainian budget. And Russia has also successfully reshaped its economy for war. The Economist, which is a very anti-Russian publication, had a piece last week saying that, you know, a lot of hopes were pinned in the idea that Russian inflation would go through the roof this year, undermining Putin and the economy. The Economist says no, they've managed to bring that under control, which means that the Russians just have far more men and far more shells. We, of course, have helped, and our help has been critical, with many, you know, high-tech weapons. But this has become a war of attrition. You know, in previous conversations, we talked about parallels with the First World War. And there, I think there's something which is very important. My colleague Bill Hartung at the Quincy has highlighted this. I mean, we all know about the decline of European military industry. But in the US, the military-industrial complex has focused, together with the Pentagon, for many, many years now on producing very expensive, high-tech weapons in limited numbers, and has totally neglected, not totally, but overwhelmingly neglected, producing cheap shells, you know, artillery shells. The Russians are outproducing us by an order of magnitude on that. And they are simply pounding and pounding away, you know, at the Ukrainian lines. And the Ukrainians are firing about 1 shell in return for every 5 or 6 the Russians are firing. You know, so there's a good deal of wishful thinking here as well, and misreporting, or, you know, reporting on the basis of, I am surprised at people.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at, Anatol, sorry to interrupt, is
no, sure.
the idea that more weapons is simply enough for Ukraine. It's a manpower issue now as well. But on the other side of that, Russia lost an enormous number of men, taking a tiny place in the big scheme of things, Avdiivka. It's not a tiny place if you used to live there. It's now reduced to rubble. Russian casualties for this 4-month-long battle, 10, 15,000 casualties, dead and wounded, just to take this one place in eastern Ukraine. Russia can't sustain these losses forever either, right?
It's not a question of whether it can sustain them forever. It's a question of whether it can sustain them longer than Ukraine. Yeah. That's all it has to do. One shouldn't believe, I think, these reports about the Russians throwing away men in human wave attacks. That is not what Ukrainian veterans have said to me. They've said it, you know, the Russians are relying overwhelmingly on artillery, and it's only when they think that the artillery has done its job and completely smashed the defence and the defenders that they have sent forward small numbers of troops to seize a position, and only then have they brought up reinforcements. In a battlefield absolutely infested with mines, you can't use mass infantry attacks. It's just not possible.
And with drones, too, doing surveillance overhead, you can't disguise an offensive. Any armored column is identified right away. It is definitely a war of attrition.
Well, that's why if we continue giving aid, I do think that there is not a certainty, but a strong possibility that we can help the Ukrainians hold most of their existing lines. But once again, the biggest disaster for Ukraine since the beginning of the war was last year's offensive, when they lost massively. Because it's clear, and we've also talked about this before, that at present, recent developments in military technology do overwhelmingly favour the defensive. Ukraine hopefully can stand on the defensive successfully, but so can Russia. And I've been trying to point out that, yes, we give more weapons, but for every weapon we give, Russia lays another 100 mines.
You've pointed out that some folks just want to turn Ukraine into a fortress state, defend the territory, and not negotiate. What is your argument against making Ukraine a fortress state?
The parallel with Israel is sometimes made. America has supported Israel over the years with, I think, something like $3 billion in aid a year. This package, America has already given more than $100 billion to Ukraine. Next package, another $65 billion. And, if you're propping Ukraine up against Russia, that's going to be $65 billion a year, on and on. The Europeans, as I say, are paying for the entire Ukrainian budget. The Ukrainian economy would collapse without European aid. And this is because, as I pointed out many times, if Syria were Russia, Israel would not be Israel. In other words, if Israel had been facing a technologically developed country with 14 times its GDP, Israel would not have won its wars unless America had, once again, devoted enormous aid, higher by 2 orders of magnitude than the annual aid given to Israel.
You're talking about the 1948 war when they were invaded, Israel invaded by 5 Arab states.
Let us also be candid here. Israel was a highly developed, highly motivated society, vastly more advanced in its basic thinking and capabilities than any of its enemies. That does not apply to Ukraine and Russia. But also, I strongly support continued aid to Ukraine. I want this package to go through Congress, because without it, I think, there is a very, very good chance that Ukraine will simply collapse this year, as the Biden administration has said. But anyone who says that this aid can be guaranteed even next year, let alone indefinitely, is deceiving either themselves or the general public, because it clearly cannot.
It is widely assumed that Putin is not sincere when he talks about entering negotiations. Understanding motivations is critical, but it's difficult to do. If Putin is, in fact, after all of Ukraine, still wants to bite off the entire country, not just part of it, how are negotiations possible under such a scenario?
Negotiations are always possible. Negotiations doesn't mean an agreement. Negotiations means finding out, indeed, what the other side wants. Putin has said he is open to talks at any time. He has offered negotiations, but he's laid down certain conditions. Now, the first of them is that there's no question of Russian withdrawal from the territories it now occupies. On that, we have to test, is Russia demanding the formal legal cession of those territories, which, if so, can't be done? Or would Russia accept what Zelensky offered in the first month of the war, which is like Cyprus, deferring this for future negotiations, And there are all sorts of formulas one could adopt under the auspices of the United Nations, at some stage to be decided by plebiscite, which, of course, like the Indians in Kashmir, the Russians would never actually do. But you see what I mean. That's the first thing to be tested. Then neutrality. that shouldn't be an issue because, as I say, we've already proved we won't fight for Ukraine. Then there are the other issues.
Anatol, when you say neutrality, you mean Ukraine would promise never to join NATO?
Or, here's a very important point, is Putin demanding just that, a promise not to join NATO? Or is he demanding something like the neutrality under the Austrian state treaty, whereby Ukraine cannot join either NATO or the Russian security alliance, the CSTO? If we got that, then that would also rule out Russia bringing Ukraine into a military alliance. That seems to me a reasonable deal. And then, like this issue of denazification, what does he mean by denazification? Has never defined it. Does that mean, and by the way, Russians I've talked to have given different answers on this at different times and different people, so I couldn't say for sure. But once again, going back to the Austrian State Treaty of 1954, under that agreement, Austria promised to ban neo-Nazi parties and neo-Nazi insignia in Austria. Germany has similar laws. Would Putin settle for that, or by denazification does he actually mean getting rid of the existing Ukrainian government and replacing it with his own nominees? If the first, that's something we can agree to. In fact, we should agree to it as part of Ukraine's path towards the European Union. If the latter, that is unacceptable, and we obviously cannot agree to it. But my point is, the only way to find this out is not by us speculating about what Putin wants. It's actually by asking him in talks. And there's this strange idea that has grown up that just by talking to another country, you are making some kind of great concession or surrender. No diplomat or government of the past thought that. You don't give up anything by talking.
Yeah, and you make clear in your paper, you're not saying that any of this would necessarily bear fruit, but you have to give it a shot.
No, but I mean, the thing is, when people ask me, what is Putin thinking? I say, well, the last time we cracked a bottle of vodka together, I meant to ask him about Ukraine, but all he wanted to do was complain about his girlfriend. How the hell do I know what Putin is thinking? Ask him, for God's sake.
You have said here, although Russia can make progress on demilitarizing Ukraine, it still has some significant reasons to want an understanding with the West over Ukraine and the broader European security order. What are those reasons?
First of all, of course, it would like a settlement whereby sanctions are lifted and the Western military pressure, well, not exactly pressure, but presence on Russia's other borders are reduced. The Russians are very worried about, if there's a revolution in Belarus, again, this could lead to some form of Polish-Lithuanian intervention, which would then lead directly to a war with NATO. Russia wants an acknowledged role in European security. This is something that it's asked for repeatedly right up to the eve of the war. And of course, Russia wants an end to the war in Ukraine, but one that, at the very least, Putin can present to his people as a victory, and that bars Ukraine from becoming a military ally of the West.
Yeah, on his terms.
Well, the thing is, though, look, when Putin invaded Ukraine at the start of this war, his goal, obviously, was to capture Kyiv and either replace or subjugate the Ukrainian government and turn the whole of Ukraine, maybe minus the western bit, into a Russian client state, like the client states of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Now, that aim was defeated in the first 2 months. Ukraine won the most important victory in the first 2 months. Whatever happens now, most of Ukraine will be possibly neutral, but independent and bitterly anti-Russian. It is not possible militarily and even more important politically for Russia now to dominate the whole of Ukraine. So that goal has already been defeated. So Russian terms have changed. Putin is now talking about, at the moment, because they don't even have the whole of these provinces. He's talking about these 4 provinces, which, as I say, none of them is fully in Russian hands.
It is amazing that after all this fighting, 2 years later, the whole Donbass is still not in Russia's control.
Well, indeed. And that is why, although clearly now, the military odds are on Russia's side, and the Kremlin thinks that Russia is winning. This by no means indicates a complete Russian victory. And once again, to go back to military realities, I think it is quite possible that Russia will take more land and small towns. But to win a kind of really smashing victory, it would have to capture huge cities like Kharkov and Zaporozhye. And of course, to win, a complete victory and take back all the land in Ukraine that was conquered by the Russian Empire, it would have to get across the Dnieper River, which looks extremely unlikely. And of course, in the process, Russia fought a siege of 3 months, lost tens of thousands of casualties, taking the city of Mariupol. Well, Kharkov is something like 6 times the size of Mariupol.
Yeah, I shudder to think what these cities would look like after such battles. What would Russia even be conquering? They'd be conquering rubble.
Well, rubble inhabited by the remains of a bitterly hostile population. Yeah. Things are going Russia's way now militarily, but by no means completely.
Are you surprised at the way the war has developed? This looks more like the First World War than, say, a modern war.
Like most people, I was extremely surprised by just how appallingly badly planned and conducted the initial Russian invasion was, and how dreadfully poor Russian intelligence was. Because, I think it's worth pointing out that if the Russians had, recruited another 100,000 men and had gone for eastern and southern Ukraine rather than Kyiv, had made a feint against Kyiv and just moved into the east and south, they would, in fact, I think, have won, because the Ukrainians would not have been able to configure their forces quickly enough in time. After that, and after the evidence that we saw of the power of the defensive, I wasn't so surprised, partly because it rapidly became apparent that this was a war of numbers. And critical to Ukrainian success in the first year was that the Ukrainians mobilized immediately. Putin, obviously for domestic political reasons, having said, a bit like America in Iraq, by the way, this isn't really a war, this is a special military operation. He waited 6 months to increase conscription in Russia. So when Ukraine launched these successful offensives in the fall of 2022, they actually heavily outnumbered the Russians, amazingly enough.
We'll be greeted as liberators, is basically what Putin said, echoing Dick Cheney.
And I talked to Ukrainian civilians north of Kyiv when I was there last year, and they said the first Russian troops who came in, who they said had behaved perfectly decently, were absolutely convinced, really genuinely convinced the war would be over in three days, the Ukrainian population would settle down, wouldn't oppose the Russians, and so forth. So it wasn't just Putin. This was a very widespread belief in Russia. After the lessons of the first year, I became convinced that in a war of numbers, offensives would be very, very difficult and costly. And that once Russia had reconfigured itself for war, really did not expect last year's Ukrainian offensive to succeed, partly because, having talked to Ukrainian veterans, many of whom, by the way, were missing legs to sort of demonstrate this, I'd become acutely aware of the critical role of mines. Mines clog a battlefield. To that you add drones.
And the drones drop mines now, too.
And the drones drop mines, exactly.
Final question for you, Anatol. What about this notion that something like this wasn't going to happen again, that Europe had finally moved past all of this, 1914, 1939? It was obviously a mistaken idea.
Look, one way of looking at
this... Well, that's if we count Russia as part of Europe, which is another issue, but go ahead, yeah.
But the European Union took the view that within the European Union there are certain rules which have worked tremendously well, and not just for people in the European Union, but for aspirants in the European Union. I saw in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, how potentially dangerous ethnic disputes were resolved or pacified by the movement to join the European Union. But as we saw in Yugoslavia, outside the European Union, deeply rooted ethnic conflicts over territory did not go away at all. And I think a key problem was, and Russians have said this again and again, look, you are expecting us to play by the internal rules of the European Union and NATO without offering us membership of these organizations. Okay, in that case, we will play by the rules of America outside these institutions. I think it's worth noting that if you look at the record of the United States, but also of France and even Britain, outside the NATO area, these countries have never played purely by internal rules. There has been a much, much harsher dedication to national interest. And seen from Moscow, and looking at the American example in the Middle East, Russia is playing by American rules. And if you want Russia to play by European rules, you have to, in some form, take Russia into Europe, which we have refused to do.
Michael Kimmage makes the argument that in his 2007 Munich Security Conference, the now infamous speech that Putin gave, that he wasn't calling for a rewrite of the international rules, the rules-based order. He wasn't calling for a rewrite. He was calling for Russian autonomy within that system, i.e., if the United States wants to go ahead and invade Iraq, which is what Putin opposed in 2003, Russia should be able to do as it sees fit as well. Obviously, Russia intervened in Syria's civil war in 2015. So I don't know.
And we intervened in the Libyan civil war.
Yes, right. A disaster, of course, yeah. So I don't know if you agree with Kimmage's interpretation of Putin's remarks.
I think Michael is absolutely right on that score. Of course, the difference is that Ukraine is important to Europe or the West in a way that Syria is not.
That's right.
But yes, I think that is the essential point. And by the way, one should remember that Mikhail Gorbachev, who ended the Cold War and was himself also bitterly critical of American policies thereafter, which he said had completely betrayed his vision of a common European home.
Gorbachev visited Congress after he had left power, and he spoke to members of Congress about how NATO enlargement and other issues were not the way things were supposed to go.
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
If we want Russia to play by European rules, we have to find a place for Russia in some way within Europe. Now, of course, it's terribly difficult. Russia's size, the very unpleasant character of the Putin regime. But, actually there are issues, like, for example, Armenia and Azerbaijan, or the unsolved Georgian conflicts, or, of course, terrorism, the threat from Islamist extremism, where we could have pursued genuinely serious consultations with Russia on a basis of equality. And instead, we always did simply insist that it's our way or the highway. And we did so in areas where, as Obama said, they are just of far more importance to Russia than they are to us.
It is hard to accept, though, the way Russia has behaved in certain places. The wars of Soviet succession, as they're often called, in Georgia, Chechnya twice, and that started under Yeltsin. Transnistria region of Moldova, Russian troops have never left.
Yeah, but, the end of empire always leaves these wars and disputes behind it. Britain has managed to ignore that because, of course, it scuttled off home, but leaving catastrophes behind in many parts of the world. The partition of India, the civil war in Nigeria, the civil war in Sudan and Cyprus. And of course, there's one area which we didn't leave, was Northern Ireland. There's also, a hangover of empire with a settler population which wants to stay with what it regards as the motherland against an indigenous population that wants, the whole of what it regards as its historic national territory. France, well, for heaven's sake, France fought a ferocious war for 8 years in Algeria because so many French people regarded it as France, because there was a French ethnic minority.
Actually, it was a department in France. It was part of France.
Indeed it was. And in most of these issues, it's not clear-cut. Nobody ever in the West asks in the Caucasus, well, what did the Abkhaz or the Ossets or the Karabakh Armenians want? We say, of course, the Union republics of the Soviet Union, only they had the right of secession. You expect an ordinary Abkhaz to understand the difference between being a republic of the Soviet Union and an autonomous republic of Georgia? No, I mean, these are very, very, very complicated issues. And, we know perfectly well that if Crimea had been part of Ukraine before 1954 and had been transferred by diktat by the Soviet Union to Russia with a Ukrainian majority population that was in no way consulted, and Ukraine was demanding that back, Western governments wouldn't have supported it, but Western publics and media would have been overwhelmingly sympathetic. I covered the first Chechen war and was very pro-Chechen. I wrote a book on the subject. But, by the second Chechen war, as a result of the first war, you did have an international Islamist fighting group in Chechnya linked to al-Qaeda, trained in Afghanistan. The Russians could not understand after 9/11 why we could not see that they had a real deep problem there, which was, now look, you can say that so much of it was their fault. You can also say much of what is happening in the Middle East is their fault, is America's fault. But, that should not suggest for one single second that anyone should sympathize with or support al-Qaeda, right?
Anatol Lieven, and we'll wrap up with some post-Cold War optimism. Actually, this is January 1989. Cold War not quite yet over.
For a new breeze is blowing, and a world refreshed by freedom seems reborn. For in man's heart, if not in fact, the day of the dictator is over. The totalitarian era is passing. Its old ideas blown away like leaves from an ancient, lifeless tree. A new breeze is blowing, and a nation, refreshed by freedom, stands ready to push on. There's new ground to be broken and new action to be taken. There are times when the future seems thick as a fog. You sit and wait, hoping the mist will lift and reveal the right path. But this is a time when the future seems a door you can walk right through into a room called tomorrow. Great nations of the world are moving toward democracy through the door to freedom.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, how old is too old to be president? Historian Lindsay Chervinsky will join us as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.